Excellent. We'll go ahead and kick this thing off. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. I'm here in Zoomland with the one and only Green Chicken, aka Doomberg. For those who aren't familiar with Doomberg, Chicken Little has his own terminal, which is all about energy, finance, and the economy at large. Doomberg, thanks again for joining us today. How's life in chicken couponomics? What's been
You
going
know,
on?
First of all, Justin, thanks for having us. And it's as I was telling you before you hit record, it's edit day for us, which means it's rest day for me. And I always enjoy edit day because I can begin thinking about the next piece and knock off a podcast or two. And you're on the schedule, and here we are. So looking forward to a great discussion. Love wicked energy. I mean, what is it's nothing more wicked than energy. So
That's it. No, it's kind of an interesting take, and I'm sure people obviously have a ton of questions as to what is the green chicken, and we don't have to get into it because you have pumped out so much content. You've answered the question about 1,000,000,000 times. So for those who are, is there a good episode or a piece or a podcast that explains the green chicken? Because I think it's interesting if people aren't familiar, but I don't want to get into it too much and take up time.
yeah, no, there's a couple out there. I think we just did a podcast with Phil Bach, BAK,
Okay.
where we did a full 70-minute deep dive on the history of Doomberg and how we built this business and how it
Mm-hmm.
became, how to identify the work of your life. And then once you identify what it is that you were meant to be doing, what are the tactics and strategies you could use to ensure that you can keep doing it because you can achieve enough financial success that you can then, spend your days focusing on what you get to do as opposed to what you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
We're just briefly, the 1 minute summaries, we're a very small team of ex executives from the commodity sector. And we had previously built a consulting firm together. COVID sort of smashed that to smithereens. We had to reinvent ourselves. We reinvented ourselves in the content creator space, and specifically the subset of that space that serves Wall Street. We discovered by helping our clients run their businesses better that we could probably create one of our own. And with at the encouragement of our best client, we decided to do so 2 years ago, and the rest is kind of a surreal history.
Mm-hmm.
We've blown up far beyond our wildest imaginations when we started, and the last thing I would say is, the single most important thing beyond sort of pursuing your passion and really sort of pouring it all out there is an authentic mindset of continuous improvement. Every day we wake up, show up, and make the number go up. That's one of our many phrases around the chicken coop, and
Yeah.
we have no hesitation to ask pointed questions about why some things didn't work and others did. Hey, that piece didn't land. Why? Like, what was it the
Mm-hmm.
wrong topic? Was the cut to paid at the wrong spot? Could the editing have been tighter? Was the intro too long? Did we annoy our ideal clients? We ask every single day. We measure 45 data points around our business, and we, to quote Jim Harbaugh, approach the Doomberg project with an enthusiasm unknown to mankind. And you can only really do that if it is your passion. This is
Of
what
course.
we were meant to be doing. And if you find what you were meant to be doing in life, my strongest advice is keep doing it.
Right. Yeah. Do what you love and it'll never feel like work. It sounds so cliche, but I'm about 80% there. And so I applaud you and the rest of the team. Again, you guys have completely blown up. I mean, just and again, for those listening or watching, I encourage you to check them out. I've got all the links in the show notes. And so whether it be Twitter, obviously your Substack is by and large your biggest source of information. And just before we get into the energy topics, like Doomberg, there is a lot of, I would say, good information out there, but from your observation and your team's observation, like is there too much information out there now that people have to sift through the bullshit, for a lack of better terms? Like, I mean, because people, you see people pumping out content, you got newsletters, you got this, you got different publish, this and that. But like, do you find a point where you just see all this stuff kind of in the background and it kind of makes you laugh and think, wow, this is easy because we're credible, we're giving out facts, we've got science. I mean, talk a little bit about that, because I just think the information age right now is just like, it's almost information overload sometimes.
So that's a very interesting question. I have a slightly different take on it. So first of all, the barrier to entry in the space is zero.
Right.
But the barrier to success has never been higher because the barrier to entry has been, decimated by the advent of technologies that make it possible for anyone in the world to communicate to a large audience if they produce, substantive quality. And the analogy would be, like all this brouhaha about AI and, what does it mean for, white collar workers and all of this stuff. And in our view, the proliferation of information is just a tool for high performing people. And you could either embrace it, make the most of it, and create something amazing out of it, or you could, ignore it, walk away from it, bemoan it. Ultimately, the mindset with which you approach technical innovation determines how technical innovation will approach you. But there's all kinds of, there's some fascinating people in the content creator space, Beth David, I forget what his name is, Valuetainment. And this guy has this great video, like how to seduce money. And it's corny and it's hysterical and it's funny and it's cheesy and it's got, millions and millions of views. And you know what? He's right. Like if you approach the proliferation of information with an attitude that is like, there's so much noise, there's so much noise, there's so much noise. Well, guess what? You're going to miss the signal.
Right.
Whereas if you approach it with, there's amazing free signal out there. And in our case, we're going to go find it, curate it, and shape it into a great narrative for our readers who don't have the time to do so because they're not doing this full time like we are, and they have day jobs and they want to find a reliable, trusted source to curate complexity for them. Then the proliferation of information is a godsend for us. This is the ultimate infinite pile of pay dirt that we pile into the front of our sluice box, and every week we go and roll out the mats and see how much gold is in there. Like it, and so like there are now on the flip side as well. There are hordes of people who produce amazing content and can't market themselves.
Right.
And so they have woefully small audiences and they get frustrated. And this gets to the other side of the coin, which I think is a key part of the Doomberg success. Like there's a whole thought out there that your information, your intelligence, your strategic insights, your content is great enough to stand on its own and people should just go find it. And to many, they think it's uncouth or unbecoming to market themselves, with a strategy and with some effect. Right. And we have written that, all this does is condemn, your work to the crowded bin of great writing never read. And so you need both. You need to embrace the fire hose of information, jump into the pool and look for the signal. And then once you have it, you should unabashedly market your ability to do that. Because people will pay for it. It's a valuable service, and we've priced our product fairly and we've gotten an amazing response. And last point I would say is, as a content creator, the vast majority of people will never pay you. And that's fine. They aren't your ideal clients. And so you shouldn't listen to them on pricing strategy, for example.
Right. Good point.
Right? You listen to what your ideal clients are telling you. So if you're running an advertiser model, like if you're running an advertiser model directed at the automotive industry, who cares what the shampoo company down the street thinks about your product? GM calls and has a complaint, you pick up the phone and you listen, right? And so the last sort of point here is we spend a lot of time thinking about our ideal clients and how do we delight them. And every business, B2B, B2C, doesn't matter, lives and dies by the following 4 objectives. Who are our ideal clients? Where can we find them? How do we entice them? And then how do we delight them? And if you focus like a zealot on those 4 things, which you can't do, by the way, if you don't sit down and actually write a character sketch for who your ideal clients are, right? Then you're just sort of random dumb luck at some point. But who are they? Where do you find them? How do you entice them? How do you delight them? We live, eat, breathe, sleep, dream our ideal clients. When our highest paying subscribers, our pro tier, send us an email, they get an immediate response. When our paying subscribers send us an email, they get a very quick response as well. When people who aren't paying us but see the free previews write us to complain, we delete the email because they're not our ideal clients. And so these are the sort of the mindsets that we described in this Phil Bach podcast. And I think they're universally applicable, but certainly directly applicable to the content space.
Right. No, that's, I mean, if for the rest of the duration of this episode, what you just mentioned is a big enough nugget to just stop now, which again is so interesting, especially from someone like myself. I've been in sales and business development, and then I've played in the marketing space, and now with the podcast, I ask those questions all the time, and they're not easy questions to answer. And so I'm curious, before we move on to energy stuff, has your ideal client changed from what it originally was anticipated versus what it is now? Like, have you had to sort of shift your sort of thinking around that, or?
No, because we spent so much time up front doing market research, as you know, with experience in the space.
Yeah.
Because we were consultants in the content creator space, we had made a name for ourselves. And before we launched Doomberg, we had actually done varying degrees of deep dives with probably 40 content creators in the finance world, and got to see for some of them a lot of their data, and help them for free, and volunteered our time. One of our expressions is giving has an NPV of infinity. So
Wow.
we're more than happy to engage. We've probably tried to help 20 or 30 professional writers or content creators since we launched Doomberg, and people have reached out to us. We always agree to do those things for two reasons. One, it's just great goodwill,
Yeah.
surf the sea of abundance,
Yes.
and two, we always learn something that makes our business better. And you never know when you're going to learn something really important that radically improves your business. And so, it's always good to give and to surf the sea of abundance. But to your question, our ideal client, the character sketches we wrote for them, they haven't really changed. And there's enough of them in the world that we could create way more than enough revenue. And as we wrote in a piece, one of our work of our life pieces, once you have more than enough, the relentless pursuit of more is actually a disease. And we have more than enough. We have more than our wildest dreams. And so at what point would we be satisfied, if not well beyond the point that we never imagined we could ever achieve? And so we are satisfied. We're not changing our ideal client. We're going to just keep doing what we're doing. Again, when you find out what you're doing in life, just keep doing it. And so this isn't work. I can't wait to write the next piece.
Yeah.
Our editor loves edit day, which is today. And we have a rule that we don't publish a piece unless we think this is the best piece we've ever written.
Yep.
And as long as we keep that feeling, and as long as it is still a get to, if you actually take a look and assess your calendar and divide the time that you spend into those two categories, I get to do that versus I have to do this. If all people listening to this podcast take from this discussion is measure that number and make the get to have to ratio higher, then this podcast will be valuable for them. And in fact, we proactively outsource all the have tos and try to design a life where all we have to do is the get tos. And when you do that, magic happens. Because again, and this is our philosophy, we're redesigning our pro tier after a year, some improvements and some frustrations with how Substack allows us to curate to that tier, and they're helping us in that regard. And as we're redesigning that product, the editor and I were just having lunch, and then we're like, well, let's start with the way in which you would like to serve that tier that is really, really fun.
Yeah.
Don't start with what you think they might want. Start with what is to be really fun, and then it'll be authentic, it'll be contagious, and you'll produce great quality, and that'll be that. And it's yeah, of course, we always need to remind ourselves of these ethos that we have created while we built this project out. But the have to get to ratio, or get to have to ratio, optimizing that, driving that number higher, it is just such a superior way to live. And having achieved mind-blowing, life-changing, humbling success, the last thing we'd want to do is squander it by trying to get more. Our intent is to savor it. I get up each day looking forward to the things I get to do.
Yeah.
We had our Doom Zoom Pro webinar today, and then I have this podcast with you, and then I'm going to go home and I'm going to start researching the next piece, and maybe I'm going to shoot a little pool and hang out with my kids and enjoy the nice late spring weather. I get to do today.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make the most out of today. And when I wake up tomorrow, I'm going to try to figure out how to get the most out of tomorrow. And it really is in this era of rat race, constant online, keeping up with the Joneses, consumerism culture. I personally spent 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder. And if you looked at my resume, you would say, wow, what an amazing career you had. I couldn't have been more miserable. And I was missing out on my kids. And I would travel for weeks at a time and just assume the bases are covered at home. And all that was a big giant lie. I was living a big giant lie. And I stepped off the train. The train kept going. I lost a lot of friends. The train kept going down the tracks. When you are in the professional world and you're an executive or you have peers, and it's a whole different world. You're in the rat race. You're in it together. You're in the foxhole with people, and you do have some enduring friendships. But by and large, a lot of that is fake. And it's only when you sort of make a true step change and you invest in yourself, you find out who your friends really are. Last point is, if you think you have 100 friends and then you make a major change in your life and only 5 remain, You haven't lost 95 friends. You've identified your true five. And so, that's a really important thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's fascinating you say that. And I don't know if you're familiar with a gentleman, Arjun Murti. He's someone I've had on the podcast and someone who I think very highly of. He spoke a lot to the same notion in terms of, the grind. And he said he was at his kid's baseball game and he'd be on his computer and it was like he brought his office everywhere. And he's over time now he's I would argue that he's in that sort of same position as he gets to do so much more now versus what he has to do. And he said one of the first times he went to his kid's baseball game and didn't have his computer on his lap, it was the first time he actually watched the game for the first, from the entirety, not just when his kid was up to bat. But I would ask you, I'm curious, do you think it's necessary to go through the rat race to finally realize what truly matters and what truly makes a person happy? Because for myself, I haven't done, I'm still somewhat in the corporate world, but I've been very fortunate in the sense where I get to do a lot of what I like to do instead of what I have to do. And I'm flexible to where I get with my, I get to do stuff with my kids, blah, blah, blah. But I say that to say, if I didn't, work drilling rigs and moved away to a different country and spent months away from, my wife, I don't know if I'd be here per se. So like, what are your thoughts? Like, do you have to go through the dirt to get through up on top to be able to get into this type of position? Or do you think it's just something that is just sort of a common denominator amongst a lot of the people like yourself?
Great question. And this is the fundamental existential question that I grapple with as I try to raise my teenage children into responsible young adults, right?
Yeah.
I had a pretty, a rough upbringing and moved out early and immigrated to the US for grad school and, showed up with, de minimis resources and nothing but ambition. And in my early days, I thought like the path to success was to get a good job and climb the corporate ladder. And I did that. But then you get there and you realize, it's not quite, you're still spinning the wheel. The wheel always spins, right? And so there's a very great question. Like there's no way, for example, that Doomberg could exist without the 2 decades of commodity expertise that we have. And my prior employers trained me extraordinarily well. I moved all over the world. I led very large teams, worked in renewable energy, worked in science, brought amazing technologies, billion-dollar projects to the market. If absent all of those experiences, the unique aspect of Doomberg certainly wouldn't be there. It's an open question as to whether if I had, had the chutzpah to try that as a 20-year-old, where things could have gone. So the counter to yes, I learned a lot over 20 years is I spent 20 years, in the grind. And one of my sort of regrets, perhaps, or if I could do it over again, is I would have widened the risk aperture much earlier than I ultimately did, because I was so paranoid about being poor as an adult as I was as a child that I felt like I was risk minimizing to the extreme. Right. Now, my children, of course, aren't replicating my upbringing, and that is the perennial challenge of sort of nouveau, well-off people is how do you sort of instill upon your children a work ethic and a motor that I had by necessity that for them would be a choice without putting them through the same swimming through the mud that, I went through, as a child. And so my hope is that there is such a path to that, because I'm not ever going to be in a position where I'd want to put my kids in the mud. I'm just a sucker. I'm a softie. And so, when they call, I will respond, and they know that, and at least they know that they're like deeply loved. But it is a challenge. It's the perennial challenge of relatively successful parents, is how do you sort of embed in your children the motor that it takes to be successful? Because ultimately, if you had me select between motor and sort of IQ, I would bet on motor every time. I mean, it's nice to have both, of course, but the parameter which explains most of the variance in life is motor, not IQ. And my motor was born out of desperation, and my kids are just simply not going to have that experience. And so hopefully there's a way to induce the motor without that.
Yeah, no, it's again, I have young kids, 7 and 4. And the one thing my wife and I talk about is it's like, if they'll never be hungry if we spoon feed them their entire life. It's like, how do we, I don't know, necessarily say manufacture adversity, but put them in positions to lose, to fail, and to have that sense of, desire to just get out and again, have somewhat face that adversity to be able to overcome, gain confidence, the self-esteem. But to your point, it's like I always say, everything for me is upside, because it's hard to complain or be down on myself when I came from cleaning toilets on a drilling rig. You know what I mean? But my son will likely never have to clean toilets on a drilling rig. So it's like, what is he going to have? It's like, where do we go? And I know we've kind of gone off on a tangent here on some topics, but this is near and dear to my heart, is these types of conversations, in as much as energy. Yeah, so again, for the audience, appreciate you hanging in there, and Doomberg, I really appreciate the sort of the thought behind of the answers that you've been giving. Let's take a pivot and dive into energy. And I'm curious from your perspective. Obviously, you've been in the industry for a long time, have followed commodity markets and energy for a long time, but do you have any core beliefs around energy that you've changed your mind on over the last few years as we move into this sort of new era of massive technology deployment, AI, energy transition, the Paris Accord? Has anything sort of fundamentally sort of shifted, or core belief shifted for you?
I would say there might be some minor changes in emphasis at the margin, but the fundamental belief that energy is life and that society is dictated by how much, net energy we can harness, and then the manner in which we distribute that energy, with some equitable mindset to all living humans, is unchanged. We are fundamentally a pro-human shop. We believe that energy is life, that your standard of living is literally defined by how much energy you personally get to waste. It sounds funny to people who don't really understand what we mean when we say that, but it is true. Entropy is spontaneous, and the human endeavor is a constant, unrelenting struggle against the forces of entropy. The right angles I'm looking at behind you won't spontaneously appear in nature. You have to impose that order on your local environment, and the amount of order you can impose in your local environment defines your standard of living. And who are we to limit the billions of other humans on the planet to less energy than us and a lower standard of living than us? I do believe that the human spirit, the planet can support many, many, many more billions of people than we have today. And the technologies do exist. And it is just really a lack of basic understanding of science that is pushing our current slate of politicians to make drastically silly choices, which of course is the market inefficiency that Doomberg exploits. And so, but no, I do think that our core belief that, which is based in physics, and so it can't change, is the second law of thermodynamics and the arrow of time dictate that, all humans everywhere want a higher standard of living, which means all humans everywhere will always want more energy. And the cleanest carbon-free way we can provide it is what we should be pursuing. And all roads lead to nuclear. And so when we started Doomberg, that was our core belief. And as we have written nearly 200 articles and researched and learned and met experts and consulted experts and received feedback along the way, a few things have changed at the margin. For example, we're far less enthusiastic about fusion than we probably were at the beginning, because fission solves all the problems anyway, and fusion is just a distraction. That's an example of a modification of our belief. But at its core, no, we are still pro-human. Energy is life, and this is the mantra that we, the brand that we have staked out.
Right. So, well, two questions. The first one, do you think that, do you think that the ESG initiatives and a lot of the goals set therein, do you think that's somewhat of a distraction to reach the North Star of providing, affordable, abundant, reliable energy, on a macro basis? Like, has that sort of put us behind? Do you think it's like, where do you kind of stand on that in terms of like actual progress towards providing enough and more energy, and especially to places in emerging economies?
So there's two answers to that question. There's the answer that addresses the core anti-human Malthusian origins of much of the radical environmental movement. And then there's the answer that addresses everybody else who has become concerned, i.e. victims of propaganda, and genuinely wants to provide for as many humans as they can in a way that minimizes the impact on the planet. And so to the rotten core of anti-human Malthusians, The expressed intent is less humans, and frankly, less humans that look like them. Let's be honest. And we wrote a piece many months ago called Malthusian Malarkey, where we show the ugly history of some of the modern day heroes of the environmental movement. When you actually go back and listen to what they said and read what they wrote, semantic shifts aside, it would be considered repulsive and racist. There's a book that we quoted in a piece literally titled Too Many Asians. And it bemoans the population explosion that they foresaw in Southeast Asia. And the underlying message is, if we don't stop this population from exploding, they're going to hoard the resources that we would otherwise enjoy. And so the anti-human Malthusian origins of the modern environmental movement is undeniable. It still persists. Many of the key leaders are actually anti-human, and they have dressed this anti-human objective in language that is sort of standard propaganda. But you could just go to the EU. Last week, they had literally a degrowth conference where they are talking about how humans just need to accept a lot less growth. Let's be very clear what they're saying, which is like you and I and your children and my children should make do with less. And they, of course, will not be making do with any less at all.
Right.
And so, but to the second camp, the people who have been victims of this propaganda, but also there is genuine pollution / sustainability questions that we should be pondering with some intelligence. We would propose that this is the following equation that we should optimize. The ratio of the total standard of living we can provide as many humans as possible divided by our impact on the planet. And if you focus only on the impact, then you necessarily end up with far fewer humans. Whereas if you ignore the impact, you necessarily end up with far greater damage to the planet. There is a needle to be thread here, which is, as long as our North Star is that ratio, energy technologies that have huge impacts will be minimized. Energy technologies that have substantial life-nourishing potential will be prioritized. And that is a ratio that leads to the following saying: there are no solutions, only trade-offs. So once we understand that there is no utopian solution, there is no green Santa Claus, that necessarily, if
There's
we're
a green
going
chicken.
to, there is a green chicken. But it necessarily immediately, it crystallizes the debate to the important question. We are going to make some trade-offs. What are those? Let's identify them. Let's be honest about them. Let's be authentic with the public. Here is the standard of living you have to give up for the marginal impact we think we might abate. Nobody wants to run on what the actual policies of end fossil fuels means, which means billions of dead people and billions more poor people. And we know we don't have to, because literally, if fission was invented today, it would be hailed as a civilization-saving invention. And we would be implementing it post-haste. And in fact, the proof of the anti-human Malthusian origins of the radical environmental movement is their steadfast and illogical opposition to nuclear power. Anybody who thinks nuclear waste, for example, is a serious issue is either a victim of propaganda or a knowing purveyor of it. And so this is our passion. This is what makes it easy for us to write piece after piece after piece on the topic. And we're going to keep doing it. And we've had success in part, we believe, because this is actually Doomberg's, name aside, a message of optimism, a bet on the human spirit, and a message of hope.
No, so nuclear, again, it always raises such an interesting question. And I think a lot of folks, again, are just uneducated or they're being influenced by the wrong message. But I mean, are you optimistic on nuclear being part of the energy mix at a greater degree than it is now? Let's just talk domestically.
Sure.
And with that, what's your take on a lot of these SMR, these small modular reactors? Because that seems to be something that it gets like a little bit of spark, but I have not seen it really be deployed at any decent scale.
Yeah, we wrote a piece recently called "Gaining Steam," where we highlighted that a major petrochemical company is deploying an SMR at their integrated site. Why does that matter? for all the attention on electric vehicles, for example, and the trillions of dollars being wasted pursuing that canard. The total carbon emissions of automotive and aviation is less than the carbon emissions from the creation of industrial grade steam. And SMR technology, advanced nuclear reactors in general, but SMR in particular, because you can make them small enough to embed them on integrated petrochemical sites, for example, they can operate at a much higher temperature than the sort of standard old reactor designs, Gen 1, Gen 2. And so the Gen 4 SMRs can give you anywhere between 500 to 1,000 degrees C steam, which actually covers a lot of the base of the pyramid of how much natural gas and coal and some cases oil that we're burning to create such steam. Most people don't realize just how carbon intense industrial steam requirements are. And Dow, previously known as Dow Chemical, and X Energy are collaborating on the deployment of 80 megawatt modules. I think they're going to do 4 of them in their Seadrift site on the Gulf Coast in Texas. And their plan, working with the DOE, is to have this up and running by 2030. That is a transformational project if it works. SMRs and the 4th generation reactor designs generally are inherently safe, walk away shutdown, literally physically impossible to have a meltdown. It's just based on the fuel design and the reactor design. And ultimately, if we're truly serious about abating carbon, objectives like this are what matter way more than installing solar panels or wind turbines. And any opposition to this is just insane. It is, I would, if somebody was to develop a micro nuclear reactor based on Gen 4, Gen 5 type designs and put it in my neighborhood, I would live there. I would live there because A, I know that I'm going to be totally safe, and B, I'm going to have the world's cheapest supply of energy, and C, energy is life, and I like life. Right. And so in the US in particular, there's a chance. We just did our Doomberg Pro this morning, and the last third of it was what we call the nuclear renaissance. And putting Germany aside, the rest of the world is really re-embracing physics and coming back to nuclear as the answer. Up in Canada, our good friends, Dr. Chris Kiefer at the Canadians for Nuclear Energy, literally got, as a citizen advocate, a doctor, a medical doctor, started a nonprofit to save, Canada's CANDU reactor technology and to promote it, and managed to talk his way into getting a meeting with Justin Trudeau himself. And Justin Trudeau has done a complete 180 on the topic, which is proof that, well-intended citizens with a pro-human agenda who are looking for ways to decouple humanity's ecological impact while still providing a great standard of living for everybody can make an impact. Same with the U.S. with, saving Diablo Canyon and the development of SMRs. Look at Japan, total re-embracement of nuclear power. The rest of Europe, outside of Germany, Germany is ever more isolated. The United Arab Emirates is just bringing on another reactor. They've done an amazing job bringing on a journey to bring on 4 world-scale large reactors and to provide their citizens with decades and decades of carbon-free, cheap, plentiful energy. And this is a country that is, substantially an oil and gas producer, thinking so far ahead for their own citizens. The answer is there. If it were invented today, we would all celebrate it. It is possible. And last point, the Malthusian anti-human environmental radicals will tell you nuclear is too expensive and takes too long. They have spent the last 40 years making sure that regulators throw up every barrier to entry as possible, with which necessarily radically increases the cost and the time. And so the cost and time of the nuclear renaissance are political choices. They're not financial ones, and they're certainly not technical ones. We are so many nines down the path of safety and effectiveness that it's absurd. And the moment we feel enough pain through our ESG choices that we will be demanding a solution, nuclear will be there and we'll be ready.
So you bring up a great point. So do you think the initiatives that have been put in place globally, a lot of it driven by Europe, on sort of the ESG climate catastrophe front, do you think a lot of people are feeling the pain to which then they are considering other options, i.e. nuclear? Like, do you think the pendulum is kind of swinging, or is it still
worse than that, Justin? The scores of millions of people in the developing world have experienced the pain, and they're not switching to nuclear, they're switching back to coal.
right? Yeah.
Right. Let's look at Pakistan. It's 250 million people.
Yeah.
Pakistan had a perfectly fine electricity grid that was powered by liquefied natural gas. When Germany scored its own goal, it scoured the world looking for every BTU of energy it could get its hands on, regardless of cost, carbon footprint, or impact on the developing world. And that's why we saw liquefied natural gas bid up to $100 per million BTU, which shut Pakistan out of the market, killed their grid, blackouts, political upheaval, all the things that come when you don't have energy. Guess what they're doing? Screw you, Germany. Screw you, European Union. Screw our carbon commitments. We're going back to coal. We're going to have giant piles of coal that we know will be there, that we can mine ourselves, and carbon emissions be damned. You know, the path function matters. And this is what we were saying to our friends in the environmental left. Like, you're pushing too far, too fast, and the recoil, the regression to the mean will overshoot. And so Indonesia, Pakistan, China, you name it, India, they're all going back to coal. Coal had a record year in 2022, and it will set another record in 2023. What have we accomplished? All we've accomplished is we've demonstrated the Western hypocrisy, the G7 hypocrisy, to the 4 billion people that are in the club. And guess what they're going to do? If we stopped using fossil fuels today in the West and sacrificed our own cultures and our own societies, all we would do is make those fossil fuels cheaper for them to use, and they will use it. That's what's coming. And so watch what we do, not what we say. Germany retreated to the coal mines with the speed and efficiency of the evacuation of Dunkirk at the moment that they saw that their grid was in jeopardy in late 2022. They brought back mothball plants. They bought coal all over the world. They bought liquefied natural gas. They burned as many fossil fuels as they needed to get through the doldrums of the German winter. Pakistan, India, China, Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, they all watch this. They're not dumb. They have their own fiduciaries to their own populations, and guess what? They're going to serve them. And so, to your question, you know, nuclear exists. Nuclear is the answer. Opposition to it is fundamentally anti-human, and it's time we put it aside.
So let's assume hypothetically that everyone says, you know what, nuclear is the answer. What have we been thinking? Let's go. Is there enough where would the investment come from? I guess obviously if government got into it, but like where to actually move the needle and create enough nuclear power, where would the investment come from? And is there money to be made in the private markets for something like this?
So great question. This is a 50-year-old problem that we solved 50 years ago. And in the CANDO report that Chris Kiefer's team put out, they show how every year for 20 years, a new world scale reactor came online in Canada. Why? It was systematized. It was supported by the government. It was the red tape was cut. So when you say cost, the financials, vast majority of the finances is being wasted on unnecessary regulatory, inspections and 10 more nines of safety when 9 nines will do. The burden of the regulatory infrastructure, which was artificially created by radical Malthusian anti-human extremists, that burden can be wiped away tomorrow with the right political agenda. So if Canada, for 20 consecutive years, could bring on a gigawatt of nuclear power using standard modular designs, and then have those plants operate for decades and decades and decades. Look, I mean, the Ontario electricity grid is the least carbon intense grid in the Western world, really. I mean, outside of Norway, which has a huge amount of hydro, Ontario also has a lot of hydro it gets from Quebec and also internally. But there's no coal being burned in Ontario. There's very little natural gas. There's some solar and wind. The vast majority of their electricity comes from nuclear first and hydro second. I drove through Ontario recently. The pavement was pretty good. The restaurants were clean. The people were nice. The economy looked good. There weren't green fish in the creeks. Like, it was a totally perfectly normal, civilized province, and
Yeah.
they've solved it, right? And so the answer is there. France gets 70-80% of its electricity from nuclear power, and even though it's bundled its own sort of maintenance of those reactors, this was all done 50 years ago. If our the ancestors, I guess, for lack of a better word, but our grandparents could do it, surely we could do it now with all we know and all the improvements we've made. And again, the cost and timeline is artificially inflated by people who are opposed to humans and want a lot less of them. We want to call that out, and we want to point out the alternatives that exist. And for sure, like, look, I mean, the Manhattan Project, I mean, again, all a matter of motivation, right? If the US government said, we're going to go with this one design and we're going to build 10 of them a year, it would be done. Now, to your question about investments, we don't give investment advice. I think uranium has probably got long-term secular bull tailwinds to it, but timing such markets and making money off them directly is not what we do.
Right. No, that makes sense. So something that's a little bit more, I guess, in front of us or on a shorter time frame, and something that we have access to is natural gas. I'm curious. So, kind of zooming in into, obviously we've got, right now we're exporting a ton of LNG. We're sitting on uber amounts of natural gas here in the US, which, like we'd mentioned in previous conversations, it's funny because California and I think New England are actually, they're having a tough time accessing or even using natural gas. But I was reading recently about the expectations on the increase in Permian natural gas export via pipeline to Mexico, say over the next 8 to 10 years. I think there's an additional 3 BCF per day of pipeline demand by 2030. That all said, could that impact the availability of Permian natural gas for LNG export and raise the concern about the sufficiency of natural gas supply to support US LNG export growth? Because we've got quite a bit coming down the pipeline over the next 5 years in terms of what we're committed to exporting.
Yeah, so we wrote a piece in mid-April called Guilt by Association, where we talked about the associated natural gas coming out of the Permian and what it means. And here's a really amazing stat. If you sort of add up what we're flaring and what we're exporting via LNG, roughly speaking, that could replace the entirety of our coal burning in the US, just sort of back of the envelope math.
Crazy.
And so we're burning something like 440 million tons of coal this year. And on a BTU basis, if we didn't export that natural gas, but instead we had sane policies to domestically take advantage of this amazing bounty that we have, we could be so much cleaner. In fact, the U.S. has radically reduced its carbon footprint, which is a story you don't hear very often. And the primary way in which it has done so is by displacing coal with natural gas. And even today, natural gas in Europe and Asia is, $10 a million BTU and $2 here. We have a 5-to-1 spread, right? We have this amazing abundance, but because California and New England haven't built the pipelines, we had in December SoCal trading at $55 a million BTU and Waha up in the Permian Basin net negative. They couldn't give it away because it was constraining the production of oil and gas of oil. And the gas, pipelines are being built and it will be exported, but the pipeline should be built to California and New England, not to the Gulf Coast, to these LNG export facilities. But they're not. And so we have, now look, those prices have since come down on SoCal and, but those extreme types of volatility environments reflect the inelastic nature of demand for these products. And the next time we have a cold snap or power outage or you name it, we're going to have these types of price spikes again. And it is true that associated natural gas is constipating the production of oil out of the Permian Basin, which is why the U.S. is still, 12.3 million barrels a day production down from 13.1, let's say pre-COVID. And so there has to be sort of a solution to this if we're going to keep oil prices down. But it is a fascinating market. The natural gas market is obviously it's not a great market to trade because the swings are so wild. It's sort of a career killer if you get it wrong. But you literally in the same calendar year, you had the exact same molecule of methane trading for $100 per million BTU in Western Europe at the Dutch TTF contract and negative in the Permian Basin. It's just insane.
Right.
And it just goes to show you how valuable the molecule is and how difficult it is to ship it, which is how these these pronounced regional arbitrage opportunities open themselves up.
Yeah, no, it is. And, again, we're so fortunate to be sitting on the reserves that we do have here in the US. And so I'm optimistic. I'm glad I live here in Texas. I'll just say that. When it comes to, I want to kind of switch gears and talk with regards to commodity prices and energy markets. We've got, right now we're on the verge of, reaching our debt limit or breaching the debt ceiling. Again, for those I'm sure who are well familiar, the Treasury is basically running out of borrowing power. And so what's your sort of crystal ball think in terms of which direction they'll go? And how do you suspect that may impact oil and gas prices? I mean, a lot of it will come back to demand, but do you think this just noise, or do you think this is like a big deal to where it's going to kind of implode markets and it's going to be a catastrophe?
I think it's a giant nothing burger. I couldn't be more sick and tired of hearing about it. First of all, this is the kind of theater that happens all the time. But here's the most obvious reason why it's a giant nothing burger. We've somehow allowed Fox News and CNN and MSNBC and mainstream media to characterize the conversation around the potential for the US to default as though the very first thing we would do when we can't borrow money is not pay the interest or principal on the debt that's coming due while keeping the entire government fully funded, right? We have a giant bloat of waste and money going out the door every day to millions of people who are never at risk of losing their jobs and have amazing benefits and so on. We can prioritize our payments. We're not going to default. Like the US government is not going to default. So calling this a potential default situation is totally misleading, and it's propaganda. Like when push comes to shove, the US government is not going to default on its treasury obligations. It may not pay its government wages, and that may suck for people who work at the government. And maybe the parks are going to be closed, and maybe some military members don't get paid, or some ammunitions don't get built, or some post office workers don't get their paycheck. All of those things are well behind the line as far as like interest payments on treasury coupons and paying off debt as it comes due. And so to me, not only is this going to get solved, even if it doesn't get solved, we're so far away from default, and the political pain and uproar that would come as we see a government shutdown. There's a distinction between a government shutdown and defaulting on the debt, and why we've allowed the conversation to focus on the default part and not the shutdown part befuddles me. So I think it's a giant nothing. It's certainly a giant nothing as it pertains to energy prices. I can't imagine a world where the U.S. defaults on its debt obligations. It's kind of a Pascal's wager situation. I'm not going to bet against the existence of God. What's the upside?
Yeah, good point. Well, something that is going to happen, Doomberg, is next year's election. So where do you see energy prices going after next year's battle of the two? I mean, historically, when one administration is in office, a lot of folks on the oil and gas side are boo, but then all of a sudden, that we produce and oil prices go up and everyone's happy on that front. But do you think there's going to be a major change in trajectory if either one gets back in or another one takes over?
As a general rule, we view democratic administrations as bullish for the price of energy.
Right.
Because they are anti-energy and humans want it. And so if you are worried about the price of energy as an investor, then you should want a democratic administration.
Sure.
And if you're worried about the supply of energy as a consumer, then you should want a more conservative administration, a more pro-energy administration. We are politically agnostic. We don't write about politics only to the extent that political observations impact the things we're writing about. We try hard. One of our rules, for example, is if we would never write about it, we don't tweet about it, which is why we've avoided so many of the traps on Twitter and the sort of cancel culture and all that stuff, because we're just, hey, the Supreme Court had a ruling on abortion. We're never writing about that, so we're not going to tweet about it. Like Doomberg is not an outlet for my personal opinion. Doomberg is the outlet for the things we're going to write about. So we would never really write about politics for politics' sake, but we would write about politics through the lens of what does this mean for the energy markets. And Joe Biden is a boon for the oil and gas producers, even though they might pretend like they hate him. The environmental movement getting control of power is extraordinarily bullish for the price of oil. It might not be bullish for the supply of it, especially if you're an outsider producing oil and you don't have to worry about the regulatory regimes and being imposed here or in Europe. The greater the ESG movement rides and the harder the environmentalists push to shut down domestic production in those countries, the better it is for you.
Right. And that was the sort of the basis of the question. Certainly it wasn't to talk politics, but it was, and again, I think a lot of people who've been in industry for any length of time have gone, have learned sort of that trend of what happens. But no, it was just an interesting question.
Well, let me give you a different spin, because it's something we've written about for the Russian sanctions and why we knew they would fail from the beginning. Like anybody who's ever spent time in industry knows you make all your money on price, not volume. And so our whole sanctions regime is erroneously directed towards trying to constipate his volume, which is only going to drive the price much higher than any volume success we could have. And so when you're in a tight commodity market, and let's say you're operating 10 plants and one of your plants blows up, perversely, that's great for you because the price is going to go up way more than 10%. You're going to more than make it up on price. And so if we had been successful in taking half of Putin's oil off of the energy markets, the price would have way more than doubled. And he would have generated more revenue. And we've argued from the beginning that if we are truly interested in the business of minimizing Putin's revenue to fund the war machine, we should be swamping the world with energy. And it wouldn't take much because we got the minus $37 a barrel in 2020, right? We see what happens when there's too much oil. Prices collapse. If we want to collapse Putin's revenue, put too much oil on the market, produce more. And of course, the industry is dumb enough that they would do it. They do it every time. And so, that this is just the sort of complete lack of basic understanding of how commodity markets work. During tight times, you make an enormous amount of money on shortages. And during times where there's plenty, you lose money because people will produce, and sell their product for below their cost just to try to stay in business and gain share, knowing that when the market tightens, they're going to make a ton of money. So, politically, if Biden wins re-election, that's a very bullish sign for the price of oil.
Sure. Speaking of market tightness, do you think OPEC is, I mean, I know they've announced and they're somewhat committing, or OPEC plus committing to, I think it was 1.6 million a day of cutbacks. Do you think they're on the verge of cutting back more? Or because from what I've learned and sort of read is their sweet spot is above what it is now. Do you anticipate any more cuts, or like where do you see that, or at least from their seat?
So the physical market for oil is much tighter than the paper price of oil would indicate. And ultimately there has to be a resolution to that question. And I think OPEC plus, they have a price they need, not a price they want. They have built societies and budgets where they have a price that they need. I think that price is probably closer to 100 than it is to 70. And I do think they will have the discipline. I think they've never been more united. I think the abuse of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve last year for overtly political purposes on the part of the Biden administration has left a very raw feeling in that group and has unified them. And the failure of the Biden administration to follow through on its what we believe to be a backdoor promise to do so at this price level has whipped up a unity within OPEC plus that is almost unprecedented. And so, yeah, I do think that they will cut and keep cutting to keep, Brent in that 85 to 100 range. They don't want it much higher than that, but they certainly don't want it much lower than it is today. Now, again, the paper price of oil, not to get too conspiratorial, but that when you talk about the paper price of gold and the physical markets and so on, there's a long history of let's say state actors influencing prices. Just this week, the whole controversy around LIBOR price fixing during the great financial crisis is now, 15 years later, 14 years later, making the headlines. It was obvious to anybody in the markets at the time that this was going on, but that was considered tinfoil and conspiratorial, right? The size of the paper market dwarfs the physical market. The physical market tightness is not reflected in the current price. We anticipate that tightness will continue, especially as the ability to draw 1 million barrels a day from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve dissipates. And OPEC knows the score, knows what the Biden administration is playing poker with their cards facing up.
Right.
And they're making, I would be surprised if we saw deviations from the discipline. And frankly, there's legitimate questions as to whether they could even keep producing at these levels, even if they wanted to. It's not just the super majors that have cheated a little bit on their maintenance capital and their exploration capital. And so I don't know. I think the structural setup for oil is still very bullish.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned SPR, and then I'm curious, and then we'll move on. But right now, I think it's sitting. We saw another draw this week. Yesterday, I think it was announced 357 million barrels in SPR. But there's talks about buying 3 million barrels in the next couple of months, which would obviously be a drop in the bucket. But it's an attempt. Do you see like how? Because you get a lot of people, and including myself. I know that it used to be a lot higher. We were well over 600 million. Now it's again, it's around that 350 mark. But how dangerous is it to have it that low? And do you think there will be attempts to fill it back up, or is it going to be a political football type thing where it's used as a sort of a carrot to hopefully tell people that, hey, we're trying? And I mean, it's just, what are your thoughts around the SPR, I guess, is my question.
Yeah. Here's the dirty little secret about the SPR. And we would categorize headline claims that they're going to refill SPR as BS. We wrote a piece in October called Pass the Salt, where we talked about the salt domes and the actual structure of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and what they were meant to be. And in fact, it can store as much as 727 million barrels of oil. And here's the dirty secret. For the better part of the past decade, appropriators of both parties have been pre-selling oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as a way to gain the Congressional Budget Office's scoring of their bills. So, for example, in 2015, a legislation was passed that increased spending and so on and so forth. And as part of that legislation, future sales 10 years out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve were put into law. And because of the way that the Congressional Budget Office scores that spending, there's no discount factor. So if you can imagine that we're going to sell that oil in 10 years and it saves us $100 million, then you could increase spending $100 million today and call it budget deficit neutral. And so backloaded by congressional mandate is probably, I forget the number exactly, but it's a lot. Like another 100 million barrels or 150 million barrels in the next few years, because a lot of this happened in 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. And so what we have is these congressionally mandated sales each of the next fiscal years.
Right.
And so if we're going to put 3 million barrels in, quote unquote, and that's the headline, I'll give you an example, like another, I believe 30 million barrels was mandated to be sold this year, and Biden front loaded those into spring to confront the driving season surge in demand. And that's really what we think pissed off the Saudis and caused them to make that production cut. Because not only were they not really serious about refilling it, they accelerated the congressionally mandated sales from yesteryear that still exist on the books, you see. And so this is the state of U.S. politics. It is what it is. So.
Yeah. Wow. That's crazy. And again, I think just how low do you think it could actually get? Like,
I don't think there's ever going to be any political support on the left to refill it. We said in the piece, when oil was negative, Trump tried to help the industry out by refilling the reserves, topping off the reserves. And it was killed in the Senate. And Chuck Schumer bragged about killing it in the Senate. Literally. So if oil being negative couldn't garner enough political support to top off the SPR, what do you think they're going to do at $70 or $80 a barrel? Forget about it. The odds of them ever refilling the SPR are indistinguishable from zero in our view. And so all this happy talk about 3 million barrels is just that. It's nonsense.
Right. So, I mean, does it not put us at a pretty high degree of risk for our energy security if in perhaps when we need it for what it was actually intended for?
Sure, of course. It's obscene. It's stupid. There's no justifying it. The people who are cheering the emptying of the strategic petroleum reserve are naive enough to think we won't ever need oil in 5 years. Like
Right.
that's the same level of thinking.
It's
like
probably
just,
the same. Or sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say it's probably the same people that are mad at oil and gas companies when gasoline was at $5 a gallon.
Yeah, look, exactly. And this is what caused Biden to panic. So I pulled up the piece while we were talking. So I'll give you one example. The Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act of 2015 calls for SPR sales totaling 66 million barrels between U.S. fiscal years 2023 and 2025. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 calls for 7 million barrels over 2026, 2027. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 calls for the sale of 100 million barrels between 2022 and 2027. All these laws are still on the books, and those sales will happen. So that's over and above what Biden's already done.
Yeah.
Right? And nobody talks about this. Now, it's clear Congress could override those laws, but then they would be scored pretty terribly on the Congressional Budget Office because they would be new expenditures at today's prices, right? And you in what world are the Democrats in the Senate going to agree to give a quote handout to the oil and gas industry? They're not.
No,
they're busy thinking they can electrify the military.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's crazy.
I made the joke about we should, because, there's a lot of industries out there that have received bailouts. And as we were just hemorrhaging money and oil companies were losing money, I was saying like the government should bail out oil companies right now. Like that seems to be a great, solution to all this, comically, obviously. And and I say all that to say it's interesting that that's the lack of education and sort of the naiveness that we base a lot of our decisions on. And that's part of the reason why I've started this podcast, was to hopefully change the minds of even one person that can hopefully change the minds of generations to come. But it's hard to grasp the lack of common sense even that we run on. The last thing I want to ask, are you okay on time? It's not a big question, but I want to make sure you're okay. Okay. We did touch on grid before we started recording. And it sounds like that's something that's sort of on the grill for you guys that you're talking about and writing about. The state of the grid, where are we at? Are we going to continue to build a pump to fill up our electric cars? What's the sort of the current scape of the grid? I think our rating on it has been like D and maybe less than that as of late. So like, where do we stand there? And is there plans to improve on that anytime soon?
Yeah, we'll leave your listeners with the following 2-word phrase, which is going to be on the tip of everybody's lips here in the months ahead, which is distribution transformers. Okay. There's a chronic shortage of them. The mandated implementation of heat pumps and electric vehicle chargers is causing neighborhood-sized transformers to have radically reduced lifetimes. The lead time to get one has gone from 4 weeks to 40 weeks to over a year. The price has gone vertical. A lot of the key components of it are made in China. We've created a grid that is on the brink of true catastrophe, in our view. Uncoordinated installation of 2 to 5 kilowatt, heat pumps and high-speed chargers and home chargers is going to overload an older generation of distribution transformers that were never meant for such loads. But we're still, despite being warned in a very alarming letter by the sort of Association of grid providers, I forget their name. They wrote a pretty sobering letter to the Department of Energy in November. And in December, what did Jennifer Granholm do? She announced a new sweeping policy mandating the improved efficiency of distribution transformers to offset some fantasy carbon emissions decades into the future, which industry has warned will only exacerbate this chronic shortage. So, for example, the industry warns that if we have a hurricane on the Gulf Coast or we have a major snowstorm in the Northeast and it knocks out an enormous amount of power, an ice storm, the timeline to restore that power is going to be stretched and very challenging because we have this chronic shortage. We also have a shortage of large large transformers, but the smaller ones, the neighborhood scale ones, are going to lead to pockets of blackouts that last much longer than people are accustomed to. And we think this is going to come to a head very quickly. Just to leave you with one last funny anecdote that we shared with our Pro Tier subscribers this morning. Okay. You know, all this talk about heat pumps in Germany, right? I talk about the law of unintended consequences. The vast majority of German homes don't have air conditioning units. What is a heat pump? A heat pump is both a furnace and an AC unit.
Right.
Millions of German homes will now have AC for the first time. What do you think is going to happen in the summer? Some models indicate that the incremental use of air conditioning by German households will more than offset any carbon emissions theoretically saved by using heat pumps in place of natural gas powered furnaces. You couldn't make it up if you tried.
Oh, wow.
But this is what's coming. This is the type of absurdity that we have to deal with.
Well, everyone put their popcorn in the microwave. It's going to get good. Doomberg, this has been an absolute great conversation. We've touched on a lot of different things. Last but not least, we've got the long weekend coming up. What does Doomberg's ideal Friday night look like? Like what, I mean, you mentioned pool, you've got kids. You're obviously a pool shark or what it sounds like, but what does the ideal Friday night look like for someone like yourself?
The ideal Friday night is I've got most of a piece done and I do all of my writing between 4 and 6 a.m. and I intend to get a piece to my editor at 6 a.m. on Saturday. And on Friday night, I have the cut to paid written and I have everything beyond the paywall lined out and the quotes from other sources embedded in the piece and the figures done. And all I have to do is wake up at 4 a.m. and write 4 or 5 paragraphs that stitch everything together. And I know that I have the next great piece done. And so I can't write at night. I can have a glass of wine at night, but I can do all of the sort of legwork that gets a piece ready. And then when I wake up at 4 and the mind is clear and my cat is sitting on my keyboard and I'm drinking my first cup of coffee and I bang out the 4 or 5 stitching paragraphs that turn an idea into a piece that I could proudly hand over to our editor. That's my ideal Friday. It's also my ideal Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, because this is what I was meant to do and I intend to keep doing it.
You know what, I love that answer. And you clearly, as people always say, are living the dream. And I commend you for it. Appreciate all the hard work and the information and the content you put out. You know, I believe it's truly making a difference and influencing hopefully us and then the next generation to come. And so Doomberg, really appreciate it. I'll put all the links in the show notes for your Twitter, as well as your Substack. Any other links that you'd like to share with me, I'll certainly do so. And for the listeners, always remember that everyone deserves access to energy and we is greater than me. Thanks, everybody.